Now, over the medium and long term, there are still a lot of positive things in the Irish economy, and I'd like to focus on three. That issue of foreign direct investment. Ireland has been very successful in attracting foreign direct investment, and it continues to be. Even up until last year, it continued to attract a lot of the best companies in some of the most interesting markets, and that process continues because in many ways Ireland is a good place to do business. There's also a silver lining to the current recession in terms of getting and increasing the flow of those types of companies, and that is as commercial property prices and wages adjust, Ireland prices itself back into the market in terms of attracting many of those companies. So brutal and all as that adjustment is, and one would have preferred that it takes place that it would take place in a different kind of way, but it does make Ireland a more attractive place for the companies that really did generate that Celtic Tiger period. Another great strength of the Irish economy is that not only does it exports a lot, but a lot of those exports, much more than most other countries, are services exports. And for an island economy where shipping costs are still a significant factor, it's important. Having exports insulates you from a lot of that. Having services exports, insulates you from a lot of that. And in many cases, services exports are less price sensitive. So competitiveness issues often don't affect services exports as much, and we see that certainly, that services exports have declined, but not declined generally as much as goods exports. So often a good thing to be focused on, and Ireland has a real strength in that area. And the final thing is the quality of the labour market and how it works. Now, Ireland is, I think, the fourth in terms of people coming onto the labour market, fourth highest in the world in terms of graduates. So very large proportion of people coming onto the labour market here compared to other countries have third level qualifications, so lots of skills. Second, the way we organise our labour market is quite flexible, something that allows employment growth to return once the economy starts picking up. And third, I think important is just a general mindset. I think people in this country tend to have a sort of get things done attitude, and that's also a sort of mindset flexibility, something that I think is important for foreign companies that invest here, and certainly that's what I've often been told by foreign executives as a benefit, one of those sort of less tangible benefits to doing business. So those fundamentals are things that are real, continue to exist, and hopefully will be the basis for a recovery when it eventually comes. But that's not to say clearly that things are good. Things are worse in Ireland than most other countries, and we can see this by comparing the domestic economy with other countries. Now, this was the slide you may remember from a few minutes ago, looking at the domestic economy in the big countries, in the big economies, big developed economies. Now, we put Ireland on the chart. The chart looks different because Ireland goes off the chart as it is now. That is how much things contracted at the worst of the downturn. So far, far beyond other developed economies. And that is, in the business, what we would technically describe as not a recession, but a depression. That's how serious it has been and how big the change has been in Ireland. One of the other ways of looking at it in a human term and human scale is unemployment. The live register, you're all familiar with the live register. It's not a perfect measure of unemployment, but it's the one that goes back for the longest, as the longest consistent data series. It goes back until the mid-60s, and it gives a good indication. The next graphic gives you an indication of what's happened recently. So going all the way back to the mid-1960s, there has never been a shock, an employment shock like this country has suffered in the past 15, 18 months. I think the graphic speaks for itself. Another measure to give you a comparative view of how things are different here, if we look at inflation. Now, this is not the local measure of inflation, which includes housing costs and causes it to fluctuate more, but this is the common European measure. So we see here that France and Germany, members of the Eurozone, very similar rates of inflation. This goes back to the beginning of last year. Now, we add Ireland in, and we'll see that for most of the time, its rate of inflation, similar to its euro area partners, but at the beginning of this year, it decoupled and broke away. And as you can see, prices are falling in this country far more than in any other European country. And that is reflective of how much demand has been taken out of the economy that we saw in previous slides. Something obviously important for you folks in your pricing decisions as well. So why is Ireland doing worse than other countries? There are three main reasons. The first, obviously, is property. I don't think there's any doubt now that those who argued that the property boom was driven by fundamentals were fundamentally wrong. That was just not the case, and that's pretty much indisputable now. A couple of years ago, I was asked to give a talk on this, and it seemed to me as though the warning lights were really flashing at that point. And I had a look at what happens in most countries with housing supply. So here we have, going back quite a long time, we have what happens with housing supply. Now, like any supply of anything, it fluctuates. But in most countries, output of houses tends to be pretty stable. It doesn't show a long-term upward trend. Now, we add Ireland into this graph. Again, it goes off the graph, but I stress you're seeing these countries and the euro area and UK and US, it's exactly the same. It looks different because Ireland is so different. So this is what happened, okay? Sometime in the mid-90s, the house building boom simply took off. No developed country has had that kind of a property boom. It simply defied gravity. Buzz Lightyear, that kid's thing, he stands at the top of the wardrobe and thinks he can jump off and defy gravity. Well, that obviously is not what happened. And the next slide then shows what happened. So clearly, the residential property sector has come to a standstill. And in my view, an awful lot of excess supply came online at that time, and it would seem to me that there's not going to be a recovery in the residential property sector for a considerable amount of time. Second and related reason why Ireland is doing badly is because the banks are broken, and that is as serious as any other country. And one way of measuring that is how banks are lending to companies. Now, here we see the amount of lending to companies, non-banks, normal companies like yourselves, that exists in a couple of economies. We look at the euro area aggregate. We look at Spain, which has also gone through a big property bubble, almost as big as Ireland's, and Ireland's. Now, as you can see, the amount of credit outstanding is shrinking very considerably, which means companies are paying back more than they're taking out in new loans. And that certainly is indicative of a real credit crunch, although to some extent there's clearly less demand to borrow from companies given the state of the economy. So there are two factors going on there. It's important to say that, but it seems to me that there's little doubt that the problems the banks are facing are causing a real credit crunch in this country, and that is a further reason why things are more difficult here. The third reason is the state of the public finances. As you can see, this is the budget deficits this year and next year in the euro area. And as you can see there, Ireland stands out, is far above anybody else. Only comparable country is Spain, and again, much of that is to do with its property, the bursting of its property bubble. Deputy Lee earlier alluded to it, and this is a really extremely serious situation for a small country to be in. Right now, Ireland is considered to be the riskiest country to lend to. So when Ireland goes out, as it's doing all the time now, to raise money, to keep these deficits, to keep teachers paid, to keep guards paid, to keep the health system ticking over, it has to pay more interest to get that money. And in my view, there is a risk, particularly if we get another international downturn, that the Irish government simply will not be able to raise that money, and that brings the crisis into a whole new area, and unfortunately that exists. Let's have a look at what happens to public debt. Now, in 2007, again, Deputy Lee alluded to this, Ireland had a very low government debt. The amount of public debt outstanding was low, very low by international standards. It's going up everywhere, but it's going up more in Ireland than any other country, and we reckon by 2013 only Italy will have a bigger national debt, and that means more taxes over a long period of time for everybody. So what are the prospects and what the outlook? On the somewhat positive, or at least less negative note, it does appear as though for Ireland the worst of the contraction has already taken place. As we saw those domestic demand figures, that took place earlier this year and last year. So a bottom is now in sight. The economy will probably continue to contract into next year, but there is at least a good reason to believe that by the end of next year, the bottom will be hit and a slow recovery can start. Much of that will depend on both exports and foreign direct investment. And if the rest of the world picks up and things go, we don't have another dip, then that will give, that will be an engine to drive Ireland out of the hole that it's fallen into. But the size of those imbalances, the amount of household debt, is something that will take time to unwind. Countries that have what we call balance sheet recessions are countries that take longer to recover than those countries that have different types of recessions, investment recessions, or recessions that are caused by higher interest rates because of inflation. But this is the most difficult type of recession to get out of and takes longer. Third, the fiscal crisis. The public finances were just appallingly managed in this country, unfortunately. Despite having gone through this in the 1980s, really nothing was done to insulate the public finances from this kind of crisis. And now we're back where we were in the 1980s with a really serious crisis, and it could get worse. And the final point, the banks, because they're broken, that will be another drag. The efforts to fix the financial system with liability guarantees, infusions of capital into the banks, and now NAMA, is all part of a long process, but there is no magic wand. It will take a long time. The model of banking in this country became evolved into a model that is now not sustainable anywhere, and that will have to change, and that does mean that banks are going to have to shrink, and the amount of lending outstanding is going to have to shrink, and that means that credit conditions are going to be tight, not just this year and next year, but for a considerable period of time, not something that is easy for folks like yourselves to deal with. So there are still very big challenges, but to end on a mildly positive note, it looks as at least the bottom is in sight, and by next year, some sort of beginning of recovery can take hold. Thank you.